Sawasdi Kararap. Did I do that all right? Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I'm not Hugh Jackman. I was very excited when you mentioned Hugh Jackman. I was hoping he was here. So I'm going to talk about the work that we've done with Renew Newcastle and now Renew Australia. And it starts with a story about my hometown and the problems of that city. And hopefully it broadens out into a set of ideas and a set of themes that will be of interest and of relevance to people here in Bangkok, in other parts of Thailand and in other communities where you are all from or have relationships to. I want to tell you just a little bit of a story about Newcastle. Newcastle is an old city by Australian standards. It's about 200 years old. It was settled in 1797. And for a long time, this is what Newcastle was famous for. Newcastle had the biggest steelworks in Australia. The steelworks employed 20,000 people in a city of about 300,000 or 400,000 people. So 1 in every 10 people in Newcastle worked in the steelworks. And then that happened. Steelworks closed. They blew it all up. It's gone. These huge buildings and these huge industries disappeared. And it left behind a city where there was a lot of unemployment. There was a lot of problems, social problems. When I was a little boy in Newcastle, when I was a student in my early 20s, there was 40% youth unemployment in Newcastle. 40% of people my age were unemployed. So it's a city that's been through some very hard times and some very difficult times over the last few years. Now, I grew up in Newcastle, but I moved away, partially because it's very hard to get work there. I moved away to Melbourne and Sydney for a while and then Melbourne for a while. And I found myself coming back to my hometown every 6 months or so and just seeing it slowly getting worse, falling apart, becoming more and more empty. You see the buildings were boarded up. Buildings that had not been used in a very long time. This is the second oldest theatre in Australia. And it's been empty all my life. It's never been used. You see empty buildings like this that are falling apart on the street. Street looks like that. And it was depressing. I think coming back, if you live somewhere and that area starts to there's some shops closed and things closed down, you don't necessarily notice it so much. You notice one shop close, you don't really notice. If you go away like I was for 6 months and you come back, half a block that I remember as a boy as being very busy and very, very active, suddenly all empty again. And it was starting to really break my heart. Just show you some more buildings. This is the post office building in Newcastle. It's a beautiful, glorious, empty building. It has been empty we're coming up towards 20 years since this building has been used. And this was the gateway to the city. If you drove into Newcastle on the main road from Sydney, Newcastle's about a 2-hour drive north of Sydney, 160, 180 kilometres from Sydney. If you drove in from Sydney, you drove past this block to get into the centre of Newcastle. So I was looking at this and I was very upset by the state of what was happening to my city and my hometown. But I was also frustrated at something else. I had an idea in about 2008. I was going to go back to Newcastle and I was going to start a small little bar. Just a small little hole-in-the-wall little bar that I thought might help open up a nice little pocket of the main street. And I actually found it was very, very hard. It was very hard to get the real estate agents to lend me, to talk to me, to lease me the properties. It was very hard to get people to take me seriously because I was young and I didn't have lots of money and I didn't have lots of resources. A lot of people had just given up. These buildings had been empty for so long, they weren't there were phone numbers in the window for who to call about the empty property, and no one, the people who answered the phone didn't even know about the property anymore. No one had changed the signs in a long time. So as part of my little project to start a small bar, I walked up and down the two main streets of Newcastle and decided to write down the address of all of the empty shops that I could see and then put them on a map. And that was the map. There was 150 empty buildings, visibly empty in the two main streets of Newcastle. Now, I'm not I'm someone who has studied. I was an arts festival director. I've been a writer. I've made TV shows. I've done other things. I'm not an architect. I'm not an urban planner. It's not my day job to think about cities and how they work. But there's lots of people whose job it is to do it. And they were all looking at the problem in a very different way to the way that I was looking at the problem. And I call it the big plan problem. Newcastle has always had a plan. This is from 1988. I don't know when this one's from. I don't know, this is 2000 and something. This is the 2012 strategy. This is from 2004. This is an artist illustration of what that street with all the empty shops was going to look like one day. For a long time, the biggest industry in Newcastle was drawing up fictitious plans for what Newcastle was going to look like one day. In the interim, not much was actually happening. For all the pictures and all the drawings and all the colour codings and all the plans, not a lot was actually happening on the ground. And I think part of the reason was that it was these people's job. They have a certain set of skills and they obviously, it's very important to think about the long-term planning. But it's their job to look 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years ahead and think about where the city's going then. What I was worried about is today, tomorrow, the next day, and the day after that. And the thing that scared me most was that the people like me who had ideas and imagination for things they wanted to do in Newcastle weren't doing them. And that, to me, that's the biggest failure you can possibly have in a place. If someone who has imagination isn't acting on that imagination and isn't doing it, then your place isn't working. You need to think about how your place works. Now, I have another background. I've been very interested in technology, and I've been very interested in culture, and I've been very interested in the way in which technology is changing the patterns of how we make things, how we buy things, how we sell things, and how that's shaping the shape of our cities and the expectations of our communities. This was the same. Remember the street I showed you? This was it back in the 1940s or 1950s. This was the centre of town. Everyone used to dress up. They would come in on the tram and they would dress up to go shopping in the city. This is it a little bit later. You're starting to see all these sort of national sort of chains emerge and more people coming in. And then gradually, these patterns of how people started to make things and buy things and sell things in the city began to change with technology, with globalisation of commerce, with increasing scale of commerce and marketing, to the point where the people in Newcastle stopped shopping in the main street. So we didn't just have the problem of the economic shock of the steelworks, whatever, but also the patterns of how we shopped and what we bought started to change as well. And so they started to move out to the suburban supermarkets on the edge of the city, which got bigger and bigger and less, got to the point where most of the people who lived in Newcastle had to drive past one of these big enclosed shopping centres to get to this main street that was now empty. But in Australia and in other places around the world, some of these shopping malls are starting to empty out again because there is yet another wave of change taking place. More and more people are buying things online. Economic patterns are changing. These are from Australian examples, but a lot of these shopping centre models are also starting to struggle. It's harder and harder to fill. Maybe we've just built too many shopping centres and there's not enough people to fill them. Amazon, you can buy things online. iTunes, there's no bookstores around anymore, there's no record stores around anymore, because all of those activities are going online, and increasingly other activities are doing so as well. So that leaves behind this, and this is that mall I showed you with all the people in it. This is it. This is the same place in 2007. Empty. One man sitting there by himself. The only person on the whole street, because about half the shops were closed. So what interested me was, what does it take to bring people back to this part of the city? And how do I take the way in which technology is changing these patterns of production and consumption and marketing and what people are interested in and turn it into something that can be a good thing for the city again, rather than being a force that's beyond our control? So I actually went back to an idea, in some ways, this is from the TV series I made recently, it actually goes back to before this was a shopping strip. Because before it was a shopping strip, it was actually a place where lots of people made things. It's the very same street. People used to make clothes and bags and jewellery and all sorts of things, rather than being a place for the distribution of things that came from elsewhere. It was a place where you could walk into a store and meet someone who had made the thing that was for sale there. What's been happening in Australia, and I'm not sure it's happening quite so much in Thailand, but I know everyone, I'm sure, is aware that Australia had a mining boom. Does everyone know we dig things up in Australia? It's our thing. Holes in the ground, put it in ships, send it somewhere else. In 6 years in Australia, these are Australian Bureau of Statistic employment data, the number of people working in coal mining increased by 74%, and we called it a mining boom. The number of people making jewellery in Australia grew by 671%. And no one ever talks about the jewellery boom. But what's actually been happening is that same technology that's moving shopping online and moving other things is driving a new resurgence of small-scale, micro and creative enterprise. I don't know if people here are familiar with Etsy. It's a global marketplace for handmade goods, but I use it as an example partially just because I've been keeping track of the figures over the years. In Etsy, you can search for... who does know what Etsy is? Yeah, so just briefly, it's like eBay, or it's a marketplace for things you make yourself. They have to be handmade things. And in Newcastle, you can search for what's being sold in your local area. In Newcastle in 2009, around the same time that we started Renew, there were 700 items being sold into this global marketplace from Newcastle. I did the same search, you can see the number at the top there, 2,161 items 2 years later. I did the same search 3 years later, and that number had tripled again. So there's this exponential growth, and most of these people are running small businesses. One of the most amazing statistics about Etsy in Australia is that 70% of Australian Etsy sales are international exports. So there are people in their sunrooms, spare rooms, bedrooms, garages, wherever they can find a space. They're making and they're creating things, sometimes as a hobby, sometimes as a business, sometimes it's going from a hobby to becoming a business, but there isn't a ladder for them to climb to turn that hobby into a business. So that's the circumstances when we began in 2008. What I wanted to do was an idea that's probably pretty simple. It was this idea that empty spaces are lost opportunities. Every single one of those empty shops and empty offices and every empty spaces in the main streets of Newcastle was a lost chance for someone to try an idea, to test a business concept, to maybe bring together a community group, to incubate a new project. And I didn't know whether any one of these ideas would work, but the theory was if you planted lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of seeds, some of them would grow. And if enough of them grew, it would make a difference to what the place would be like. I'm a really big believer in the idea that initiative and experimentation and not just capital are keys to revitalisation. You don't just make better places by building newer, expensive, shinier things. You make better places by trying lots of different things, by running experiments in different models and different ways of doing things. And in doing so, you can uncover unlikely things that you didn't know were going to work. So we set up a not-for-profit company in 2008. We brought together a board of people from the arts, from architecture, from business, from legal, from accountants and community backgrounds, and we built a model. Our not-for-profit company was a simple model. What it does, we go to the owners of those 150 empty buildings and we say, can you lend them to us so we can lend them to someone who wants to incubate a business idea. We'll pick someone that you're happy with, someone that fits with your strategy of what you're trying to do or what kind of activity you'd like to bring into this area. And we set up a lot of I won't bore you with all the details, but basically we borrow the buildings on a rolling 30-day basis. So if the owner gets a better offer, they just give us 30 days notice and we move out and they move their better business in. We manage all the insurance, we manage all the permits. We start from the principle of what can we make easy. So rather than saying, wouldn't it be great if this had a restaurant with a live performance venue and a brewery running at that end of the room? It's a small space. How about we just find someone who needs a small shop and that fits what the space is already good for? So we work a lot with trying to find things that we don't need complicated permits for, that we don't have to jump through complicated hoops for. And a lot of the work we've been doing in Australia has been about, I talk about, this is why the Prime Minister loves me, talk a lot about trying to work around bureaucracy by trying to find the hacks, the little loopholes, the little ways that you can... So we got precedents. We used contracts that they were designed for putting mobile phone towers on buildings and used those as the basis of the agreements we used to allow access to our buildings. We collected up things, the loopholes in the Planning Act, which said if you've got a shop and you want to turn it into another shop, you don't need a permit. So we identified all those things we don't need a permit for, and then tried to do as much of that as humanly possible to bring activity back to the city. And I hoped in 2008 that this would be an engine for change in Newcastle. Well, this is where we began. This is the mall again in Newcastle in 2008. At the beginning of 2009, we got our very first property. We signed our very first partner. Our first partner was a multinational listed property company, a company called the GPT Group. They're a multi-billion-dollar company. They're no small enterprise. They were very sophisticated about what they were doing. And we have worked with everything from multinational listed companies through to mum and dad investor who own one empty shop. We got the people of Newcastle and we said, come to us. If you've got an idea for, there's some rules. Whatever we put into this space, it has to be original. It can't be competing with existing businesses in the area. We don't want to be trying to slice the pile smaller. It must be doing something different to the other businesses that are already there. And you need to make what you do. Whatever it is, whether that's design, whether that's fashion, whether that's music, we don't care, but you have to make what you do. And then we began turning these spaces over to these spaces. There was a lot of sweat, there was a lot of working bees with paint rollers and people moving in one by one. Empty shops gradually being filled up. This is a photography gallery. Community photographers came together in this space. This is an upcycled design store in a shop, a bare concrete shell that had never had a fit out. This is an art installation. It was a visual art space. If anyone knows anything about contemporary art, you can explain to me why the artist covered the walls in latex and then got the public to rip it off. But if you've had 2 or 3 drinks on opening night, it's a lot of fun. This is a sound art gallery, the only dedicated sound art gallery in Australia. It's art you listen to. It's a very niche interest. There's not a lot of sound art fans out there. But one thing I should add, in a regional city in Australia, if you set up Australia's only dedicated sound art gallery, it turns out the sound art fans from all over Australia will come and visit. So you go there on opening night and people had come from Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne because they were sound art fans and this was the only sound art gallery in Australia. This is a collective of mostly young mums who make things like kids' clothes and bags and jewellery. They did this fit out on, we have in Australia, we have Hard Rubbish Day, where about once a month or once every few months, you can put your big items out on the street and a council truck will come and collect them. So they went around and took all these items from the side of the road and used them to furnish their shop. They spent 60 Australian dollars, I don't know what that is in baht, someone can do the calculations, but not a lot, on this whole fit out. And they couldn't afford paint. So they got the ends of all the white paint tins their friends had in their garages at home, and they mixed them up into one big bucket, and they made a unique shade of white. It's the only place you will ever see that shade of white. It's a really nice fit out, and such a simple change to make such a difference to that little part of the street. This is an old ophthalmologist. It was an eye doctor's surgery. And it had these tiny little consulting rooms where all the individual doctors used to have their offices. Turned it into that. This fit out was done. The people that we lent these spaces to were they'd mostly been home-based laptop businesses, like a graphic designer, a photographer, a guy who runs an online publishing business that's now grown into a multi-million-dollar business and is now partially owned by one of the largest media companies in Australia. We lent him a space in this space, and he grew his business from there. And because they were all in design and aesthetic kind of businesses, they made it look pretty good, pretty cheaply. This is the same street. So I started to tell you, where that man was sitting by himself, that was here, in front of the empty shop. I won't go through all of these, but these are a fashion label, another collection of artisans and makers, another fashion designer. These guys were running a record label from their bedroom. They're young guys. They make unlistenable noise music. They had a record label where they were recording music locally and exporting it online and iTunes and all that. They didn't need a shop particularly, but when we gave them a shop, lent them a shop, it really helped them grow their business and have a much more visible presence. If you've heard of any of those musicians, you know more about that niche music than I do. This guy's an architect. I love this. This is a simple fit out. It's a tiny little space, no budget and no certainty because he's only got it for 30 days at a time. The ceiling is done with fishing net and clothes pegs, like you use to peg things on a clothesline. And it looks really nice, really simple, really cheap. These guys were young boys and they designed T-shirts and skateboards. The youngest was 17 and the oldest was 21 when they came to us. And I thought, I'll lend you a space and you can try your skateboard design business there. I would have thought, at 17, I would have thought it would be a valuable learning experience. They might learn something about how to run a business and then they'll close down in 3 months' time when they get sick of it. And I was completely wrong because 6 years later, they have a successful business that is exporting Newcastle design T-shirts, their own retail shop, and they're also making and exporting Newcastle design T-shirts and skateboards around the country and in some cases around the world. More and more examples. This is a co-working space. And this is another example of how we work with space. So this was pristine office space. The owner said you could use it, but it's A-grade office. He just spent money on the carpet and the walls. You can't put a nail in the wall. So it's called The Roost. The sign is actually just letters cut out sitting in the windowsill. And all of the things in the foreground, they're on trestle tables so they can be picked up and moved. And this project, it has about 30 separate individual businesses working out of this co-working space. And today it has a full commercial lease. And a dozen or more of the businesses that have been through that space now have their own leases and their own businesses and have gone on to start successful and viable businesses in the city. I won't go through all these, but this is Newcastle. This is the Newcastle that Lonely Planet was talking about, not the one I showed you at the beginning. This is 2012. This is a jeweller's. I've got a little video of there a bit later, but a great example of a very successful project and a really beautiful shop front that they've done. This I love just because it's another cheap fit out. All of the shelves are drawers from old furniture that they got from the dump, from the rubbish, and have just made that wall fitting. And if you'd seen this building empty, it was the ugliest. It's a really bad 80s like arcade. It's done a great job with it. This was a department store. It was an entire city block. And we couldn't, it was a firm called David Jones, who one of the major department store companies in Australia, pulled out of Newcastle and said, I don't know what the equivalent would be here, but they left behind an entire block where this big department store had been. We couldn't fill the whole building. It's 4 stories tall, and there's some safety issues and other security issues with the upper floor. But what we wanted to do was make sure that the street was active. So we basically built these wooden partitions that you see here just 10 metres back from the windows, and then in the window bays we built these little spaces where individual businesses like fashion designers, artists, interior designers, these ladies make kids' clothes, so that this whole block, which had previously been dead, is now full of these vibrant windows that are all homes to niche, original, local businesses full of people who make original things there, where you can walk in and talk to the person that made the thing. So this is Newcastle today. This is the same street. This is the cafe, some of the cafes and restaurants and businesses that have opened. These are some of the other businesses that aren't ours that have moved in, because when the people started to come back, the commerce came back, when there was foot traffic, other businesses had the confidence to invest in the area, and this creative dynamic created a place that was different to the suburban shopping centres that everyone had to drive past, and gave people a reason to go there, as opposed to just another place where you can get all the same things you can get from another shopping centre. Cafes, restaurants, all these spaces have opened up. And then there's just beautiful experiences. Like this is Studio Melt. They're a jeweller. They work on the street. This is jewellery made out of coal, which is also... Coal is Newcastle's biggest export. Not that sort of coal, the big boat coal. But as you can see, it's a really nice experience of visiting and exploring that street and meeting those people who make those things, being part of classes. There's a lot of classes and training and exchange that takes place where people can actually learn how to make things as well as sell things. And so there's this whole local economy that has grown up around these spaces that were once empty. Now, to take you back to the map at the beginning, all of those red dots were the empty buildings in Newcastle. This is about... So I haven't updated this in about a year or two, my apologies. But all of the green dots are properties that Renew Newcastle has borrowed from their owners, reopened, and are no longer empty. From that to that. A lot of the red dots have disappeared just because... Turns out having people around has made it easier for the owners of those buildings to lease them. There's some orange dots. These spaces, they're the spaces that we're still using. But the before and after transformation is quite extraordinary for the city. All up, since we started, Renew Newcastle has launched more than 220 projects. I actually haven't updated the number on this slide. We just opened our 80th building in the city. Depending on whether you count the whole city or just the parts where we've been working intensively, the vacancy rate has dropped between 50 and 90%. Each year today, Newcastle has 500,000 more tourists coming to it, according to the state tourism data, than it did before we began. So 500,000 extra visitors a year. That makes a huge contribution to the local economy. Vandalism, graffiti vandalism, windows being smashed, has dropped by 25% every year since we started. So it's a huge, huge drop over the course of that period of time. This mall that I showed you, the one with no people in it, last year Newcastle Council did their tourism survey, and they asked tourists to Newcastle, what was your favourite thing about your trip to Newcastle? The number one thing was the beaches. There's really good beaches. The number two thing was that mall. And that, 10 years ago, I would have told you, if you visited Newcastle, do not go to the mall. It's scary, it's dangerous, it's full of drug addicts, it's terrible. Two of our projects, of the 220 projects that we've done, about 30 to 40 have now signed full commercial leases and are their own viable, sustainable businesses. Another 60 businesses or so still exist in the city, either in co-working spaces or in shared spaces or sharing offices where they don't have their own leases, but their businesses are continuing, and we help them along the way of that journey. And there's about 20 other places around the world that are using the model. As mentioned in the introduction, in 2011, Lonely Planet brought out their list of the top 10 cities to visit in the world. Number 1 city to visit in the world was New York, which is a very good city if you haven't been there. But the number 9 city to visit in the world was Newcastle. Number 9, I will take that. I thought that was pretty good. And I love this actually. If you can't quite see this thing at the bottom, but this is from the Sydney Morning Herald. And it's fair to say people in Sydney don't think about Newcastle very much. And it still sort of says in red at the bottom, Sydney has never made the list before. So to have Newcastle as the only Australian city in the top 10 was controversial. And I think if you read the comments on the Sydney Morning Herald website, there's a lot of people in Sydney who've never been to Newcastle, and they know why they've never been to Newcastle. Lonely Planet wrote, Australia's most underrated city has transformed itself from a steel city to a creative hub with an explosion of artists, photographers, fashion designers, digital artists and more as part of the inner city regeneration scheme Renew Newcastle, citing it as a key reason. This is another travel magazine story. I won't go through all of them, but the model has now been picked up in lots of places. And just to quickly sort of give you some examples of the variety of things, these are projects from parts of inner city Sydney. This is one from Townsville in North Queensland. This is in Cooma, which is a small country town in regional New South Wales where there are a lot of vacancies in the main street. They've had 9 successful properties convert to commercial leases in Cooma using this model. And this is great. This is it's a big wool growing area. And this is what I love about this project. It's not about getting everyone to do the same thing in the same places. It's about bringing out the local flavour and character of any given place. So in this big wool growing area, they run wool making workshops and wool dyeing workshops and have people who support making wool. There's also this guy, Ethan. He's 11. He makes T-shirts. He's got his own shop. It's extraordinary. These ladies, they're at the older end of the age spectrum, but they're also working with the local materials. Cooma's first 3D printing lab in this tiny town in New South Wales. This is from Docklands in Melbourne, which is a very new area that's been redeveloped, probably not too dissimilar to this area, where there's been a lot of new investment in new buildings. It's been hard to fill them with the right sort of mix. And so we've helped start some interesting projects there, from artist-run galleries and initiatives through to other things. This is a 3D printing studio and design lab, which has been a really interesting success story, and a business that's helped other businesses prototype projects, as well as being a space where people can come in and find out about 3D printing, make things themselves, etc. These are fashion designers in Adelaide. This is in wood turners in Port Adelaide. This is just a little story from the newspaper in Adelaide talking about how an old dead arcade in Adelaide, in South Australia, is now bustling and bursting with activity because of a partnership with Renew Adelaide there. I just want to kind of finish on a couple of lessons before I finish up. The thing that I noticed about Newcastle when we first began the project is we had 150 empty spaces, but only a really small proportion of people in the city were in any realistic position to actually do anything with them. There were people who had capital, they had connections, they knew the right people, they had lawyers, or they had town planning people who could help them do their permits, or they had architects who could help them do their designs, or for whatever reason, a small proportion of people had the know-how and the resources or could afford to pay for it. What I wanted to do was pretty simple. I wanted to bend that curve so that a wide variety of people could experiment with what their city could be. And my theory was, some of them are going to have terrible ideas, some of them are going to have great ideas. But it's only by giving them a chance to actually test them will we find what will actually work and what will actually be sustainable. What I've discovered along the way is, and what my argument is, that great places, they're not planned. They don't just drop down on high. No matter how good the plan is, it never quite works the first time. You've always got to tweak it. You've always got to experiment. Great places come from organic experiments. They come a little bit from the accumulation of trial and error. For every two things that don't work, you discover one that does, and the one that does that stays, and you build on that, and you build on that, and you build on that. You discover how cities work, you don't just plan them. And so I think the process that we've been engaged in with Renew is not one about building or designing a city, but one of fertilising that process of planting those seeds and seeing what grows. Thank you very much.